These are the socks my grandmother bought me. This is how indoctrinated they were. Okay? I am going to keep them because I want to sweat on Justin Trudeau's face through my feet. I want him to lick the feet sweat. So, if you didn't already hear this, pretty righteous headline. Cowessess First Nation becomes the first to control its child welfare system. Here's how it works. A Saskatchewan First Nation made history Tuesday after Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Premier Scott Moe signed an agreement that will see the community retake jurisdiction of its child welfare. In March 22, the Cowessess First Nation members decided they want to assert their rights for the children and their families and help under Canada's landmark Bill C-92, which empowers Indigenous communities to reclaim jurisdiction. This is an incredible new thing. Maybe you can see a quick summary.
Together with Cowessess First Nation and Saskatchewan, the Government of Canada is signing the first ever coordination agreement under the Act, respecting First Nations, Inuit, Native children, youth, and families. That has been the work of reconciliation that communities like Cowessess has led on over the past many years. That we can come together to sign this today, mere weeks after the tragic discoveries, is because over the past years, leaders like Chief Cadmus and others stepped up to help us co-create legislation that recognizes that child and family services that take kids from their communities and remove them from their cultures, from their languages, from their land, is not the path forward that we need to walk as a country. And the kids...
What's with the scuffed socialist audio? You're a neolib. You should have, like, the finest audio available. He didn't wear an orange shirt, but he's got a little pin of an orange shirt. So, you know, that's kind of uwu.
Need to be kept by, protected by, supported by, and taught by their communities.
Yeah, I just noticed that. Fucking Canada. It really doesn't help me constantly trying to disprove that Canada is a made-up world of cartoonish proportions.
So we co-developed legislation called C-92 that will ensure that as we move forward, kids get the support they need and the protection they need.
Okay, so why is all this important? Why is this significant? What exactly is going on here? Well, if you didn't know, then let's see if I can draw it out for you. Let's do a little quick lesson, everybody, okay? Oh, this was my lesson from yesterday. All right, let's see if they have the right clip arts here. What do we get if I type in Canada? Oh, okay. Let's use the old-timey flag. This is the original flag of Canada. Here's the original flag of Canada. Horrendous, I know. So this is Canada, the country, okay? And then what happens is Canada has its first prime minister, Sir John A. Macdonald. Sir John A. Macdonald, the first prime minister of Canada, was a white nationalist. I'm not saying that flippantly in the way that everyone on the internet that you disagree with is a white nationalist. He was someone who believed in the superiority of the white race and felt that other races were inferior because of it. I will now read you some quotes from our first Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald. He justified an amendment taking the vote away from anyone of Mongolian or Chinese race. He warned that if the Chinese, who had been in the country as long as Europeans, were allowed to vote, that they, quote, they might control the vote of that whole province with their Chinese representatives and would foist Asiatic principles, immoralities, and eccentricities. He further claimed that the Aryan races will not wholesomely amalgamate with the Africans or the Asiatics, and the cross of these races, like the cross of the dog and the fox, if not successful, it cannot be and never will be. He also established the Indian Act of Canada, as well as the residential school system of Canada. Of course, his quotes on that aren't any more great. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It is strongly impressed upon myself as head of the department that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from their parental influences, and the only way that they could do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they acquire habits and modes and thoughts of white men. AKA, we gotta turn the Indigenous kids white. which is kind of the idea. So they invent the reserve system. So if we have a really rough, crude drawing of British Columbia there, nice and crude. So we got all the little islands off to the corner here. Cool. Most of people in Canada live on the border, right near the United States, pretty much this line down here, and this is where everyone lives. The reserve system of Canada, which effectively established a new set of laws, put reserves in some of the most remote areas of the country, places like here, where obviously no one lives. And so the Indigenous population in Canada were then forced to all congregate and squish in these tiny little areas that had deplorable living conditions, that didn't have clean water, that didn't have adequate food. And surprise, surprise, because they were so remote, their levels of unemployment, because what exactly are their jobs doing in the middle of nowhere, was astounding. So that was the reserve system in Canada. On top of that, they established a residential school system in Canada, which would take all the children from their families and put them into residential schools, where they, of course, would be systematically tortured, beaten, raped, all that kind of stuff, and to have the culture essentially withdrawn from them. So that's the residential school system. It's the one you've probably heard about. It's the one you all know about. Now, here's where things take an even grimmer turn. How much do y'all know about something called the 60s scoop? Because you probably heard that term before. You probably heard it. And when you hear the 60s scoop, it kind of sounds like it's some kind of funky news ordeal or something like that. It's like, ooh, what's the scoop, you say? Well, the 60s scoop was a phenomenon that went well into the 1980s, in which tens of thousands of Indigenous kids were taken from their families by, again, the provincial and federal governments of Canada, and they were placed into white foster homes. Many of those white foster homes were American white foster homes. And guess what? Those kids were sold. They were sold. Some of them for as high as $10,000 to white families to adopt these children so that they would be taken away from their proper homes. You heard that right, everybody. That was the thing that Canada was doing. Marlene Oregon recalls the day that her adopted Louisiana parents told her they bought her for $30,000. Her brothers, they told Marlene, were freebies. I left her feeling worthless. They told me I should feel grateful they paid for anything for me at all, Oregon said. I felt so guilty. And the latest revelation, as story survivors say, has haunted them for decades, the money behind the 60s scoop. The scoop, as it was called, refers to the era in the 1960s to 1980s when child welfare authorities scooped up Indigenous children and adopted them out of non-Indigenous families. They placed them in homes outside of the country, and they weren't just adopted out of their Indigenous homes, and they were mostly placed into white American families that they were bought and paid for. It hurts so much. I've waited so many years for someone to finally talk about this. Diane Fassett, whose brother Willie was seized in Ericsdale, Manitoba, a home and adopted by a couple in Indiana. His value, Fass said the brother went for $10,000. His mother said they used to own him. Carla Williams, also from Manitoba, was adopted family in Holland for $6,400. Manitoba twins, Allison and Deborah, ended up in Pennsylvania, where they said they were valued at $10,000 for the pair. Wayne Smellgrove calls it human trafficking. Because it is. It's 100% child trafficking, and it was done by the government of Canada. My adopted parents paid a lot of money for me. They farmed us out as American Adoption Agency, and then they sold me. It sickened me. William said the thought of transactions is revolting. They were surprised to hear this. Now retired in the 1970s, she was an adoption worker from the Pennsylvania-based Tressler Lutheran Home for Children. They worked hard to find homes for children with special needs because they didn't want them. The children, so these are some of the ads back in the day. These were ads you would see in local newspapers for, again, the human trafficking that was taking place. A child is waiting. Happy, playful girl. 3-year-old Sherry can quickly win your attention with a smile and a big brown eyes. An attractive girl. Ooh. How about this one? A child is waiting. Youngster loves outdoors. Don't let his serious look fool you. 20-month-old Jason is a happy boy who enjoys playing with children and adults. He has fine dark brown hair, big brown eyes, chubby cheeks, dark olive complexion. Wow. Yeah, these are sales pitches for, again, human trafficking that was going on in this country. It gets worse. The Métis of Canada, who were traditionally known as the half-breeds, as you see before you, they often have a whiter complexion because they were a mix of either Scottish and French, and Cree people. They had one of the worst events involving the 60s scoop because they were easier to sell to white families because they looked less Indigenous. So that's also a thing, also a big thing that happened.
I think she's coming. It's a day that 25-year-old Carla Williams thought would never come. The end of a 17-year struggle to get home to her family and a birthright that was taken from her.
I'm so happy.
Carla is one of hundreds of Native children placed in non-Native homes in the 60s and 70s. That was the practice of Manitoba Children's Aid until 1982. Children were taken from family and community and placed out of province and sometimes out of the country.
But I knew I was Indian, and I knew I had my own family. And that's why I didn't accept these people as my parents either.
She speaks 4 languages. Not one of them is Cree, the language of her people on the Fisher River Reserve. When she was 4 years old, she was taken from her alcoholic parents, later adopted by a Dutch couple and moved to Amsterdam. What followed was a horror story. Teenage years of sexual abuse by her adoptive father, a nervous breakdown, the birth and loss of 4 children, and finally prostitution on the streets of Amsterdam. She saw no escape.
Nobody wanted to help me. Nobody listened. And I didn't know where I could find the help that I needed.
A Native childcare agency finally found her and brought her home. For Provincial Court Judge Edwin Kimmelman, Carla's story is tragic but not unusual. He reviewed the issue of Native adoptions in a report in 1984.
Because the children were lost entirely. They're lost to their culture, they're lost to their people, they're lost to their family. That's genocide.
Chief Louis Stevenson works for the Native Childcare Agency. He says the government was negligent in the past. It's indifferent now.
It warrants redress, and they should compensate for all the trauma and the grief and the harm that they've done to people.
The Manitoba government says Carla's case was handled appropriately. If she needed help overseas, caseworkers never knew.
Now, in terms of this being a sordid story of our past, I'm sorry to report that it's still happening now. In fact, of the adoption system in Canada, while Indigenous people make up about 6% of the total population, the children in the adoption program in Canada make up half, 50% of all the children in the system are Indigenous. Now, I know what you're thinking, and I can already hear the liberal argument, all of this being, of course, well, at the end of the day, that's because these Indigenous families are terrible and they're just, incredibly abusive, and we need to protect the kids, and so that this is just a sad reality. This is systemic racism. I'll have to remind you that this is again a situation that was created by the government of Canada. They were the ones that invented the reserve system. They're the ones that have not been adequately making the reserve system livable. There's still 53 reserves in Canada that do not have clean drinking water, as in you cannot drink the water that comes out of the taps, or you could get sick and die. So that's an ongoing problem now of a system that they created. They, again, also put a lot of these reserves in remote areas, which is what contributed directly to their high levels of unemployment, which, yes, if you do not have a job, it's more difficult to take care of children, and they will most likely join into the welfare program. On top of which, a lot of these reserves were also put near waste sites. If you look at the map of Nova Scotia, you can see that there's an enormous amount of reserves that are really close to waste and garbage sites, which of course do not help for the health and welfare of the people living there. That being said, if you're looking at the cases and just by the raw numbers of why is the reason that people are being taken away from their families, and we compare First Nations children and their maltreatment to non-First Nations children and their maltreatment, we will see things that are actually a little bit surprising. Now, the one case in which it's striking that happens in First Nations families is something known as neglect. This is often not being able to take care of a kid because you do not have a job. That's the most common form of it. And that one is, yes, decidedly higher, although it's not outrageously higher than non-First Nation families. That's 46% to 29% of the cases. However, physical abuse is occurring at a much higher rate in non-Indigenous communities towards children. That's 23% versus 9%. Sexual abuse is around the same, 3% to 2%, still higher amongst non-Indigenous families. And then emotional maltreatment is almost the exact same. Exposure to intimate partner violence is higher in non-Indigenous families. So that does not account for the outrageously high number. Something that does, however, is the fact that there is, again, a huge amount of subsidies and bursaries you can get for adopting First Nations children in this country. That's one of the driving factors behind the huge amount of adoption that takes place in the country as well. And unfortunately, many of the children in these adopted agencies are becoming the victims of sexual abuse. Tina Fontaine was 15 when she was killed and her body was thrown into the Red River. Phoenix Sinclair was 5 when she was beaten to death and her body hidden away in a landfill. Her death went undetected for 9 months. Cameron Usken, who had been regularly bruised and had head injuries, was only 13 months old when he died. What these children all have in common is that they were Indigenous and they were all foster care in the province of Manitoba. They are just a handful of hundreds that have died in foster care in the last decade. For the more than 10,000 Indigenous children in Manitoba, foster care has become the new residential schools with all its attended abuses. In the residential schools, Indigenous children were forcibly removed from their families and communities and placed into boarding schools where many were starved, neglected, tortured, and medically experimented on, physically and sexually abused. More than 6,000 of those children never made it out of the schools alive. Of those who did survive, they and their families and communities have suffered intergenerational trauma. However, the abuse did not end with the closing of the last residential school in 1996. Today, there are more Indigenous children forcibly removed from their parents and placed into foster care than there was at the height of the residential school era. Today, despite being less than 7% of the population in 2011, Indigenous children represented more than 48% of all children in care in Canada. In Manitoba, that number was a staggering 85%. Let that set in. 85%. Jane Philpott, Minister of Indigenous Services, has described the situation as a humanitarian crisis. Yet despite strenuous advocacy from First Nation leaders, child welfare experts, and regular citizens, the federal and provincial governments have not made any substantial improvements yet. In fact, in the last decade, the number of Indigenous children in care is increasing, not decreasing. Dr. Cindy Blackstock, and if you aren't familiar with her, please get familiar. She is an absolute legend who heads the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, filed a successful discrimination complaint under the Canadian Human Rights Act against the federal government for purposely and chronically underfunding child and family services for First Nations. Despite her legal victory, Canada has refused to stop discriminating against First Nation kids in care. This is despite the fact that the government's own records show that underfunding First Nation child and family services is a major contributing factor to the overrepresentation of First Nation kids in care. So again, this is happening now, it's ongoing, and yes, the federal and provincial governments are directly related to the situation. The situation could be considered a national crisis. Not only do Indigenous children die in foster care, those that receive face incredible life risks for not of their own making. British Columbia found that less than half of the children in foster care graduate from high school. Indigenous youth make up 35% of all youth criminals in BC. A 2001 study found that 2/3 of all Indigenous people in prison had been involved in the child welfare system. Let that set in. 2/3 of all the Indigenous people in jails in Canada were in the child welfare system before that. That is a startling statistic, to say the least. However, the risks don't end with lower educational outcomes and prison rates. Half the victims of sex trafficking in Canada are Indigenous. A 2016 global, and again, this is 6%, 6% of the population, and yet half of the people involved in human trafficking in Canada. Human sex trafficking. A 2016 Globe and Mail report found that in Toronto, despite being less than 1% of the population, they represent 20% of the trafficking victims. In Edmonton, 40% of the victims of trafficking are Indigenous. While there's no central database, the RCMP have noted that Indigenous girls under 18 are most at risk. Or the information that has been reported, the majority of victims came from foster care. Therein lies the tie between foster care and the crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. Indigenous children in care are the most vulnerable to be abused by foster parents, sexual predators, manipulative traffickers, and a society that has long ignored the sexualized violence committed against Indigenous women and girls. What remains is the uncomfortable part of the crisis, where doctors, lawyers, police officers, judges, and some foster parents see Indigenous children in foster care as vulnerable targets for sexualized violence. In 2013, the Human Rights Watch documented numerous reports of sexualized violence and assaults committed by the RCMP themselves in BC against Indigenous women and girls. More than 8 officers were put on leave after many reported sexualized violence committed against Indigenous women and girls. Judge David Ramsey died in jail after pleading guilty to targeting Indigenous girls for sexualized violence. Those whose job it is to protect Indigenous children in foster care have in some cases become the opportunistic predators. This should come as no surprise after the 60s scoop. The massive adoption of Indigenous children and non-Indigenous homes became a buy and sell trade industry for Indigenous kids. A report from BC found that Indigenous children are 4 times more likely to be sexually abused in foster care than in non-Indigenous children. Of those who were abused in foster care, 2/3 of those were Indigenous girls. More than 4,000 murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls are in Canada. So, I know that's a lot of heavy, dark shit, but it's all true. And I want to keep hammering this point home because there seems to be a disconnect between what happened in the past and what's happening now. There seems to be this idea that this all shut down in 1996 when they closed the last residential school, and then that's the end of it all. There's no more. Don't worry about this. The genocide is over. We can wash our hands of this. Everything's better now, you know? We got Justin Trudeau. He dresses up and it's real poggies. Everything is fine. No, horrifying atrocities are still being committed. And I don't want to take away from people's lived experiences, because I know a lot of people have been talking about this, especially when Canada Day was coming around, saying, I come from an immigrant family, you know, which half of my family can attest to that. The other half of my family originates in Catalonia. And so they're very, very proud of Canada. They love the opportunities Canada has given them. And I don't want to take that away from anyone. Okay? That's a beautiful thing. That doesn't mean you should ignore the ongoing genocide of Indigenous people in this country, because it's still happening. And it's happening on a systemic scale. It's happening to thousands and thousands of young kids. And that is a very serious crime against humanity that needs to be addressed and needs to be stopped. These are the socks my grandmother bought me. This is how indoctrinated they were. Okay? I am going to keep them because I want to sweat on Justin Trudeau's face through my feet. I want him to lick the feet sweat.
Thanks so much for watching, everybody. Can you do the thing, you know, that thumbs up and comment and all those things that help us out in the algorithm that controls every aspect of our lives? Also, if you happen to have a Facebook account, can you delete it? Like, just delete it. You should probably delete your Facebook account, because it's not a great company. But hey, if you can't do that for whatever reason, I understand. And could you also go to facebook.com/thesurftimes then and give us a little like and a follow. We're just trying to push back against the fact that people like Ben Shapiro happen to dominate the platform entirely. And when everyone asks, why do older generations believe the things they believe? One of the problems is the majority of them on social media use Facebook. So to counter that, we're just going to be on there too now. Also, if you happen to have a union or a worker co-op or even a leftist project, podcast, website, Zoom, MySpace, it doesn't matter. We will advertise it for free on this channel. All you got to do is go to weareserfs.com and use the forms that we got there, weareserfs.com. Thanks, everybody.
To our gods, Xander Corvus and VK Jehannam, we are prepared to commit human sacrifices for your eternal glory. To our monarchs, the Tim Caucus and Tom Spiker, we are humbled to be your oafish jesters, clowning around in your royal court. To our lords, Evan Nudie, Tofox, Ryan Lubin, Trevor R., Jeff Lamb, and Alexander Thaler, we shall proudly carry your standard onto the battlefield and die for your precious land. To our esteemed Knights of the Round Table, Dark Puppy, Jenna Towell, Anna Loves Riley, Quiet 185, Omni, Riley and Anna, Poodlehawk, Multimondi, Trevor Janis, Lemmy 101, Anthropophojak, Saren 42, Chronic to Hemphog, The Great Pudini, Bone Genie, Catherine, Radical Maniac, Ramona Costa, J. Fraser Cartwright, Jimmy Bignuts, Violent Orchard, Sophie Baby, Andreas Chiringuito, Zach Christensen, Yopi, Josh Mickelson, Todd Buckingham, and Todd Lajeunesse. We raise our glass, we raise our swords, and we salute you.